A lot of times when we think about the American War of Independence and the various advantages and disadvantages that the different sides had, one of the common things for the Americans is, oh, well, they're fighting on their home territory. They know the ground. And we're all used to that common example, like some, captain or lieutenant or whatever is kneeling down in the brush and there's some Native American alongside them sort of pointing out the rough terrain of what's in front of them, and so they can, get the edge on their opponents who are over from England. They don't know anything about the local area. And that's all well and fine, just having some local guide if you're dealing with, 10 guys on a ranging or foraging mission somewhere. But as you may imagine, things get a lot more complicated when we're dealing with an army, some 10,000 men having to cross over a river or through a mountain, or having to even set up camps and whatnot. And for that kind of operation, that big scale where you need maps and measurements and precision, that's where these gentlemen come in. Surveyors and geographers of the Army. Sure, both sides had access to plenty of maps when the war started, but older maps can be outdated, and you don't want to march those 10,000 men over to a river crossing only to learn that the bridge you thought was there had collapsed a few years prior. Up-to-date information is key to any campaign's success, and particularly of those smaller and ever-changing details, like the presence of certain buildings on a farm where maybe you're expecting a battle will take place, or the precise elevations of a road where you're hoping to get an artillery train through. General Washington was a surveyor himself, and he knew how all of this stuff worked. He knew how important it was. So as early as July of 1777, even before the French were bankrolling the rebels and the resource allocation was really difficult for them, Washington was petitioning Congress to allocate funding for the creation of a department of geographers for the Army. And to create this department, professionals were pulled from all walks of life. Some were already in the Army, yes, but others were civilians. They're being brought in and given military roles. Most military roles during this time period didn't require a great deal of formal education, or really any education at all. The two major distinctions for that being the artillery and the Navy, which are both very technical services and far more merit-based as a result. The geographers were similar. You can't just pull anyone from the ranks and say, hey, yeah, go make us a map, and they'll guesstimate it. That won't work. They needed professionals to form this department. But, why would I sit here and prattle on about these men's qualifications when they could tell you themselves, or at the very least, their recreated selves?
So Robert Erskine is back in to be the first head geographer. He's a Scotsman, a hydrologist, a inventor, tetrahedron chevaux de frise they put in the Delaware and some of the rivers to stop ships. He invented that. They're still digging some of those up, or they're floating to the top, even in modern times. So he's our first head geographer, and he's working out of Ringwood, New Jersey as an ironmonger doing the Ringwood, New Jersey ironworks. He's using that as an office, trying to run both the geographers and the forge. Washington says, you need to come to camp because what you have is very, very important. Should the British get a hold of that, now it's back to an even playing field. So the information that we were making as far as the maps was very, very important.
And then we were brought in and we were commissioned. We were made officers because we were there to direct and supervise surveyors. A lot of the people that did the actual chaining and the brush cutting and stuff like that were soldiers that we would draft out of the other regiments to do the labor work for us. We were specialized. We were the ones that were gathering the data as far as the angles, recording the distances, doing the office work to put that data on paper, prepare the maps, do the calculations. That's what we were there. So we were, as I said, we were commissioned as officers, and we were given certain benefits by being we got good pay. We had other benefits, correct?
We were allowed a 2-horse wagon to transport our gear, a horse for ourselves, our servant or batman. So yes, we were given quite a bit as far as that goes. Sometimes we're confused. Some think that we're not military, but we are soldiers. We are in the military. It's just not carrying a firearm. And so we are fighting with our pen and our paper, giving a heads up to to Washington and the generals on where they might maneuver their logistics for the war effort.
So now let's look at some of the many tools and devices that these men were using to ply their trade and actually create those maps and other forms of information for the army to use. And of course, what better device to start with than that most basic of surveying equipment, the compass. You'll immediately notice how this compass looks a little different than what you might expect. So how is it used? And what are these two big arm things sticking up on its sides?
We see here we have an example of a British, what they would call a circumpeter or a compass. This was made by William Collier in London in 1720. As you see here, it's quite a fancy mariner's face with all the points on it. The intricate engravings as such. In the 19th century, it'll start dissipating and it becomes more planar. But some of these early instruments are just genuine works of art. The compass, of course, here is the needle. I talked about the steel pin that it rides on and the pivot, and that's underneath the cap. And so here we are responding to the Earth's magnetic field. And no matter where I turn this, our sight vanes, as you see, it'll float, and then it'll settle back into the magnetic north. Because we talked about the magnetite. Magnetite is a boon to us, a very useful tool to be able to give the virtue to the needle in the 18th century. It also is a detriment. When it's in the field or in the ground, it will attract what we call local attraction. As you saw the individuals, or the two polemen were, two poles stuck in the ground. That's our forward sight. We would also do a third pole in the rear or the back sight. And as we progress, we leave that back sight there. And so that's our indicator that should we start to veer off, or the needle start to veer from a straight line, we can suspect that we have a local attraction that is naturally occurring in the ground, such as an iron deposit or a magnetite deposit. You see on here it's got a cap, the brass cap. It's conical inside, riding on the pin as it spins. These are sight vanes, and as you can see through here, you would look through this small slit. There is a horsehair that is in the vane on the corresponding side, and so that would be that's our zero meridian through these arms and through this compass face from north to south or south to north. As you can see, he was quite proud of his instrument, so he signed it. It's Will Collier or William Collier in London. He was in business from 1710, 1735, but this particular compass we know is 1720 because the characteristics of the undercarriage. It rests on a three-legged staff, and then the three legs are of wood, the staff head is of brass, and it swivels so that we can keep it level. Later on they'll put spirit levels on them, but in the 18th century, as long as we can spin this and the needle doesn't drag on the face nor hits the glass, then that is level enough for us.
In layman's terms, you look down your sight vanes and place a trail of these tall poles and make sure that they line up as perfectly as possible with the horsehair sights on your compass. And that way, when you take the distance between those various points and you go to chart them later on your map, you're going to know exactly which angle those measurements are taking place from. So long as you know where you are, you'll be able to put the direction appropriately on the map, as it were. But then what about that second plot point, that distance? Well, there are a lot of ways to get that, including something that many of us may recognize, a perambulator, a wheel of measured circumference which you walk with, and as you do, you count the number of rotations the wheel is making, which would thus give you a total distance. In fact, these tools, just like many of the same principles of surveying, are still in use today, and you'll find them in all sorts of different hardware stores and construction sites and whatnot. Another popular method of getting that distance, although it's certainly less recognizable to us today, is this, a Gunters chain, which is made up of a set number of links, each again of a measured length, with 2 stakes on either end of it. So what they can do is place one stake into the ground, and then, every surveyor's favorite job, they pull chain. they carry the length of that chain across towards their second point of reference. And when the chain is taut, you can push the second stake down, undo the first one, and carry along the way. When you finally reach the point that you're measuring to, all you have to do then is count the number of chains and links for the total distance. Remember, each full chain is a set number of links, and you know the length, the distance of each link. That makes the maths nice and easy. In this case, one link is equal to 7.92 inches, and 100 links makes up a single chain, which is exactly 66 feet. So, if a distance is measured as 1 chain and 5 links, you can translate that into 69 foot and 3.6 inches. And I promise that was not intentional. It's just a number I threw out there, and that's how it worked out. This helpful little chart here has a full list on all the various measurements that were often taken using this technique. Oh, and looking at that second set of measurements, it's something worth noting that there is actually a second kind of compass that actually had 4 sight vanes to make capturing squared distances that much easier. But we'll let Tony show off that piece and a wider assortment of other devices available to the geographers a little bit later on. For now, it may be worthwhile to hear a little bit more about how these compasses actually worked. I mean, well, magnetism, obviously, but the link between electricity and magnetism wasn't really uncovered until like the 1820s. So how are these people in the 18th century actually creating their compasses? Now, all right, I know it sounds a little clickbaity, but the answer may surprise you. It definitely surprised me. It's interesting stuff, so please do stick around through this talk as well.
So I'm going to tell you a little bit about magnetism. The Earth is a giant magnet, actually. The North Pole, South Pole, there's a magnetic flux all around us. You can't see it. It's out there, but it is a magnetic flux, and we use that in our compass being attracted to the magnetic north. And so before 1820, there was no way to give virtue to the needle or make the needle magnetic, but by lodestone or magnetite. This is a raw form magnetite. Even in modern times, they don't know exactly how it's made. They think lightning strikes because heat, and it's near the surface. So this is in raw form. It has a north and south meridian, just like the Earth has. We will take it because humans like pretty things. We will cut it in cubes. Not quite so pretty. Let's take and put it into a silver jacket, which is non-ferrous, a keeper to keep the flux moving around when it's in storage. And as you see here, these are iron poles on the north and the south respectively. So we put this on here as a keeper, and then of course it is magnetic. To give virtue to the needle, we would take our stone and we would strike the corresponding pole. The needle has a pivot in the center, a little cap you'll see later. It has a pin that's very sharp, so it has low friction, and that is our centerpiece, so it will spin. The case is covered in ray scan, or what we call shagreen, and so that keeps it protected in transport. Let's talk a little bit about how this magnetism looks. We stated the fact that it's not something you can readily see, but if we use an indicator such as these metal filings and we place it on our paper, just sprinkle it around, you will see that even this raw stone, so that will excite the filings. And if I take that around, you'll see the poles and also the lines of magnetism.
So magnetism and magnetite, which sounds like a Pokemon, but apparently it's a really important thing, that's what makes surveying possible. But do you know what makes this video about surveying possible? Well, that's right, it's the video's sponsor, it's HelloFresh. If you're like me and are not only horrible at cooking, but also too lazy to do the proper grocery shopping and meal prep, HelloFresh is an excellent way to introduce yourself to the world of cooking. Everything they send you is pre-measured for their recipes, so you don't have to worry about spending tons of cash on ingredients that you'll never use, and each recipe spells the whole process out in very plain and easy to understand terms. Even I could understand it. They have tons of quick and easy options like their 20-minute meals and easy cleanup dishes so that you can spend your time on what really matters this holiday season: your friends, your family, and watching my videos, of course. All their ingredients travel from the farm to your home in less than 7 days, so you know that everything that you receive is going to be nice and fresh. And if you ever change your schedule, say you're going to be out of town when your box is usually delivered, well, you can easily change the day or delivery address on their website in just a few clicks. This chicken is the second HelloFresh meal that I've prepared, and really the entire process has been really easy so far. And then yesterday was pork tacos, and while I do admit that I couldn't make it look quite as pretty as it does on the recipe card, it still tasted fantastic, and we're definitely going to be saving those little recipe cards for future use. I've enjoyed the service so far, and if you're interested in trying it for yourself, you can go to HelloFresh.com and use the code 18BrandonF for 18 free meals plus free shipping. Thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video, and now back to map making, which is not so simple as a HelloFresh recipe, but will also help you win a war. And HelloFresh can't do that. So, all right, using our compass, we've come up with a direction or an angle, and then using the Gunters Chain, we have a distance. So the surveyors will mark all that information down in a field book as a number of simple data points, and then they can send all that information off to the office, or, well, to the tent if you're on campaign, for them to be charted. In this case, we're going to be charting out a road.
Okay, it takes 2 bits of information to lay down a map. You need a direction, and you need a distance. With the compasses, circumference you saw outside, that is determines our bearing or our direction. With a Gunters chain, this is our measurement of the day. This Gunters chain is 66 feet long. It's kind of a weird way to measure, but it's an established measurement, and we stuck with it. The established portion of that measurement is, if I take 1/4 of that chain, that's a rod or a pole. 10 chains end to end is a furlong. 80 chains end to end is 1 mile. So we stuck with that dimension, but what the great thing that Edwin Gunter did with the chain was he divided this chain into 100 equal lengths, each length being 7.92 inches. The beauty of that is it now becomes decimal math. If I have 15 chains and 24 lengths, 15.24, it's quite easy to do the math. To complement this Gunter's chain, we have a Gunter scale. And the way this Gunter scale works is it is represented here with 1 chain, 2 chains, 3 chains, and so on. This represents the lengths of chains. So if I have, say, 1 chain and 84 lengths, I can come in on the 8, drop down to the 4, and now come here to the 1. I have just recorded 1 chain and 84 lengths on my dividers. So to lay that to paper, at the end of the day, my survey crew would come in with field notes, and they would have bearings and distances on this note. So I'll go to my first set of numbers as I'm laying down this road here, and the next set of numbers I've got station 1, 2, I'm coming up on number 3. Number 3 station says that they were on a 62-degree bearing. So I'll set my protractor to 62 degrees to north, and a 0 reference on there, and I can mark 62 degrees. With that, if I take my parallels and set them to 62 degrees, I can now walk this over to wherever I'm working, just like this, and maintain that 62-degree bearing. I've got 1 chain, 84 lengths on a 62-degree bearing. I mark this, the line in, and now I move on to my next set of numbers. With that, moving from point to point to point, I create my road. And you can actually see on this map, this is a copy of the map that was developed by this unit during the Revolutionary War. And you can see where they set their compass station up, and they pulled chain, and they took a bearing and a distance, and then set it up again, pulled chain. Every time they'd pull chain, they would actually move the compass and then do a back sight to make sure there was no magnetic influence under the ground that may be influencing that compass needle. So as long as this bearing agreed with a 180-degree bearing backwards, then we know that we're good and we move right along down the road. And that's how it's done.
So at the end of the day, you see that these basics really aren't that complicated, actually. At least they're not mentally very complicated. But we're not talking about just building a road for the city. We're talking about military campaigns here. And as simple as the concept may be, pulling chain takes time, and it requires a lot of physical man-hours to make it happen, and sometimes that's just not possible. For example, say you're trying to measure out over bodies of water, or even if you're trying to get the lay over an enemy fortification during a siege. Well, you might find that the enemy isn't quite so amenable to your taking careful measurements, which you can then use to range in your artillery. And in those instances where you can't rely on a surveyor's compass and a chain, there exists another tool called the plane table.
And this is an alternate way of doing a survey other than using a surveyor's compass and a chain, where you have to measure the direction and then measure the distance to every point that you're going to show on your map. With the plane table, I can do a survey just measuring the distance between 2 points. And the way that works is, for example, we have a building right here that we want to locate and show on a map. Now, I picked a point here where I can see 3 corners of the building. What I would do is I would pick a second point a little distance off where I could see the same corners, and I would measure accurately from one point to the other point. And then I would take my plane table, which has a compass mounted on the side of it, and I would orient the table to north by turning it until the needle on my compass lined up with north. And then on my map paper, I would pick a point that represents the point over which this table is set. And I would then pick a second point which would represent the second point that we picked that we could also see the corners from. And then with the surveyor's chain, we would accurately measure from one point to the other. And then taking that distance, say it was one chain, which is 66 feet, and then I could plot that on paper to a scale at maybe 1 inch equals 10 links. So that would be these points. So then what we've done is we've established a baseline, and then anything else that we do on this paper is going to be to scale also without having to do any measurements, and I'll show you how. So I have the table oriented to north. I take this, which is what they call an Adelaide, which in this case is basically a ruler or a straight edge that has sights onto it. So this point represents the point over which I'm sitting. So I would take this Adelaide and I would look through the sights and I would look at the corner of the building over there. And I would draw a line on the paper. I would line it up to that point and I would look at the second building corner and I would draw a line on the paper. And then I would take it and I would look at the third building corner, line it up to that dot, and I would draw a line onto it. And then we won't do it, but I'm going to explain that what you would do now is you would then pick the table up, take it over and set up over the second point that we had established. We will reorient the table to north, and then from the other point, we would look over and we would sight the building corner over there, the first building corner that we looked at, and we'd draw a line. Those lines are going to intersect, and we would look at the next corner, draw a line. These two lines intersect. We would look at the third corner, always orienting to the point over which you set up, and draw a line. And then if you connect if you connect those points that you just established, what you've done is you've just located that building. And you can see this is the way the building would actually be. Now, since we had a baseline and it's plotted to scale on the paper, everything else is going to be to scale. So then using our scale, we can measure from this point to the building corner and determine what this distance is, or this distance. We could from this point to this point, we could scale and determine the dimensions of the building. And then you can start making a map. Now, you know, if we were set up in a place where we could see multiple corners on multiple buildings, we could locate the Adena Mansion on the hill up there. We could locate the barn. We could locate the cook building behind us and everything. So this is one aspect where this table works, and it works quickly. Another benefit of this table is if you're surveying and you have some inaccessible points. Just say that you had say there was a river here and you wanted to locate a building on the other side. Obviously you couldn't measure physically from this point to this point, this point to this point, this point to this point. But using the plane table, all you have to do is establish 2 points to scale, and then you can go ahead and do the survey here. So obviously in wartime, this would be a very useful tool to use if you were behind, you know, the lines of your Continental soldiers and you wanted to locate something on the enemy's side of the field. You could do this without physically have to go over there. You could actually use this as a surveyor's compass by carefully orienting it to north. And then the scale around the outside, the wooden scale here, has 360 increments, so it's divided the same as a surveyor's compass would be. So you could actually use the pin in the center and look from here to one of the building corners, and then you could read the number of degrees that you are off of magnetic north. And then you could measure physically from the point that we're setting over to that building corner and then plot it on paper. But I don't prefer to do that. I prefer to use this in the method that I just explained to you. Doing the other type of surveying, I'd much rather use a surveyor's compass.
We mentioned how a river might impede one's ability to measure distances. Well, what if the river itself is what you're attempting to chart? Knowing just how deep a body of water is at various points can carry very obvious military utility when it comes to moving ships down a river and such. But how can you reliably keep track of the distances and such when you're on a boat that's constantly bobbing and shifting on the current? You definitely can't have a man with a surveyor's compass sitting on top of a rowboat with buoys in the distance serving as your reference points.
Several years ago, we had a very interesting project. We were down at Mount Harmon, which is a historic site in Maryland, I believe. And we were right on the bay down there. We set ourselves a little project where we wanted to do a hydraulic survey, where we were going to survey part of the bay to determine how uniform the bed of the water was at that point. So this map is a result of the work that we did. And this roughly represents the shore. This is the ground over here. This is the water out here. And we had a boat out in the bay, and we wanted to do soundings at various stages, soundings being measuring the depth of the water at any given point. So we established 2 reference points right on the shore of the bay, and each one of them had a surveyor's compass set over top of it. And each one of those compasses was oriented to north, north being off to my left here. So the boat is out here, and it came to this point, and it stopped for a second. And they dropped their plummet to measure the depth of the water, and at the same time they held up a flag. As they held up a flag, this compass measured the angle from magnetic north to our line of sight where the boat was. Simultaneously, this transit, this compass down here, did the same thing at the same time. It measured the angle from magnetic north to where the boat was. And as you can see, this line of sight would go that way. This line of sight would go this way. Those two lines of sight would intersect. That would indicate the actual location of the boat. Being that these 2 points were established where we could see, and we measured accurately between the two. On paper, we plotted these 2 points to scale. In this case, 1 inch equals 50 lengths. And I don't remember what the distance is, but it was plotted to scale. So being that this is to scale, anything else on the paper is going to be to scale. So from here, we can determine how far it was out to that, to where the boat was. And then the boat moved to here. We did the same thing, 2 intersecting lines of sight. Here, same thing. Here, the same thing. And as the boat moved along, they determined the depth of the water here was 6 feet, 6 feet, 6 feet 2 inches, 7 feet, 6 feet 6 inches, 6 feet 6 inches. So the bed of the bay was very consistent right in that area there. Had we had more time and the boat was available for a longer period of time, we would have done a second row of shots and a third row of shots. And then we could probably see the slope of the bed of the bay as it got deeper going away from the shore. So once again, very simple. With one measurement, we were able to gather this data, put it on paper, and have an accurate depiction of what the bay bed looked like at that point.
And on the same note of taking these measurements in difficult terrain, a quick piece of adaptable hardware ought to be mentioned, because while a lot of these tools require a nice and level surface for you to actually be taking these measurements, well, that ideal isn't always very practicable, is it?
So as we've seen all these instruments, we've got them placed on pretty level ground. But what about if we've got a hillside? We have three legs on there, and some steep hills, of course, 2 legs would touch and 1 would be out in midair, which is no good. And so we carry what we call a Jacob staff or a single staff, and so we could place it there and then put our compass upon it, and that way we could keep it level and read off of that.
So, at long last, by whatever measurements it was made, you were able to chart them all, and finally you have a map. Huzzay! Now you can pack it up, send it out, and the Army can get to using it, right? Well, of course not. It took you ages to plot that thing out. What if it gets damaged in the journey? I mean, sure, you have all the data points recorded and everything, but it takes ages to draw all that out and chart it out and make sure that it's all the right distances and everything. Yeah, you definitely don't want to be recreating the entire thing again, but still, the Army needs their maps, and it is kinda your job. And maybe even more commonly, well, what if the Army gets the one map, but then they want copies? What if they want one that's in a different scale? That'd be really complicated. You know, Washington needs one really big map for planning everything out on his table, but then he wants, you know, say a series of 1/3 scale maps that he can then give to his officers so that they can then carry out those plans. Well, as you may have guessed, you don't have to just guesstimate it. The geographers have a tool for that as well.
Okay, what you're viewing now is the pantograph, actually known as a reduction pantograph. But it can be used to enlarge or reduce maps. I have, this particular one was built in the around 1750. It's a brass instrument with ivory wheels. We have lead on our pencil here to provide weight. And as I trace with a stylus, it will reproduce the map on another piece of paper. I'll raise my pencil. I lower this down, and as I move, it reproduces the map. And there's an efficient way to reproduce maps. There was also an item called a copy glass. There are no examples of copy glass in existence anymore, so we're, rather than try to replicate a copy glass, we know that the pantograph existed. Also, I can change the scale of the map. Right now it's at 1/2 scale, but I can go 1/4 scale by moving these slides here and here. And the important part of this is when it's all set up, all three of these need to be on the same plane. If not, the whole map goes cattywampus. So if I need to draw this particular road coming down towards part of Philadelphia, if I put my stylus on this and I can drop my pencil down to the paper, and the best way to do this, being a straight road, is put a straight edge to it. So I'll use my parallels for that. And now, as I move this, it recreates the road. And once I'm to this point, and then I'll move right down here. It's a rather efficient way to do it.
And that definitely makes more sense than sending out the original copy or just remaking the map from scratch every time. So finally, in this video about the Department of Geographers, we come to the fact that we haven't actually spoken about geographers at all. Everything discussed in this video so far has been covering surveying, which is done by surveyors. You don't need a full-on geographer to do this kind of stuff. A geographer is an educated man. He is a natural philosopher, a scientist. If you need a map of a battlefield, yeah, you send a surveyor. He'll stand at the big tree, measure the distance to an enemy position, and map out the obstacles along the way for a small-scale and rapid deployment map, if you will. But if you need to map out an entire mountain chain, you need an entire colony-wide map, well, at that point, things are obviously going to get a whole lot more complicated than just a couple of angles and distances. You can't quite send out a couple of guys with a single chain and expect them to measure the distance of Pennsylvania. For a job that big, you're going to need an awareness of your global positioning. You're going to need a geographer.
When we talk about geographer, we're talking about the fact that the Earth is curved, and when we try to make a flat map, we have to have a way to project that curvature on a flat piece of paper. So my job as a geographer would be to use celestial navigation tools, the sextant and nautical almanac, to calculate our latitude and longitude so that we could lay out proper curved meridians. The meridians are the lines that run north to south. They converge at the North Pole and again at the South Pole. We can look at the octant, which was the 18th century equivalent to what you might think as a sextant. An octant is an eighth of a circle. A sextant, being a sixth of a circle, is somewhat bigger and gives you more angle measurement. Basically, it's just a protractor. It measures angles. We use it to measure angles between celestial bodies. It could be used to measure angles between anything we wanted. If we just rotate it on its side, we can use it to measure angles between trees, something that we use a surveyor's compass for. This would be pretty awkward to do it that way. It's used by reflecting the sun, moving the index arm, and as you move it, the sun will appear to move. You bring the sun down to the horizon. It's interesting that here in Ohio, we don't have a flat horizon. Our horizon is uneven because of trees, mountains, other discontinuities that prevent us from having a straight line horizon. So in order to overcome that, we use a tool called an artificial horizon. We would fill the artificial horizon with a reflective liquid. In the 18th century, they used mercury or treacle. Treacle is nothing more than molasses. It's reflective, and any liquid is self-leveling. So we put enough to cover the bottom of the pan, put the lid on it, and this lid essentially prevents wind from rippling the surface. We can set it on the ground, and then when we bring the sun down, instead of stopping at the horizon that's a straight line, such as the ocean, we bring it all the way down to itself in the liquid. We then take that angle, divide it by 2, and continue the calculations the same as we would had we brought the sun down to the surface of the ocean as the horizon. Very common in the 18th century were the nautical almanacs, which in fact are still produced every year. This one is a reproduction of the 1778 nautical almanac, and it gives the declination of the sun, the location of the planets and moon in relation to one another, so that those can be used to calculate longitude, which in the 18th century was a long and difficult calculation. Here are sample calculations to calculate latitude and longitude. Latitude is a very direct calculation. On sea, sailors would have calculated their latitude every single day at noon. It's done at noon local time, not clock time. So you would wait till the sun was on your meridian. You can do that with a simple method as placing a stick in the ground, and when the shadow is the shortest, the sun is directly on your meridian. Latitude could be calculated in just a few minutes. I'm looking for the sun in the horizon glass, and there it is. See this lens? Okay. Now, as I move this and bring the sun down, it's coming down, and I would bring it all the way down to my artificial horizon. Then read the angle. The angle is 82 degrees, 40 minutes. I take that angle and divide it in half. That's 40.5 degrees. I subtract that from 90 to get my zenith distance. Add zenith distance to declination from the Nautical Almanac, and I have my latitude. Longitude, on the other hand, required extensive calculations and extensive mathematical knowledge. After Robert Erskine died, Simeon DeWitt assumed that he would get the job as geographer. But there were other people being proposed. One was William Scull, and another man by General Anthony Wayne. Simeon DeWitt thought that he would have the job automatically because he had worked in the geographer's office under Erskine. He wrote a letter concerning William Scull to George Washington saying that Mr. Scull, a fine surveyor, knows all there is to know about that art, but he can't even calculate a simple latitude of a place. So latitude was considered the very basic calculation for a geographer, and DeWitt is making known that Scull, who might want the job as geographer, is not even capable of that. He's a surveyor. Calculations for longitude are quite involved. In the 18th century, before the invention of good timekeeping devices, a method called lunars was used, where the angle between the sun and the moon were measured. Then extensive calculations, and you could calculate the time in Greenwich. You could get your own local time with something as simple as a sundial. Subtract the two, we know that the Earth rotates at 15 degrees of latitude per hour. Multiply the difference in time by 15 degrees per hour, and you have your longitude. In the Navy, on a ship, it was only done 2 or 3 times a month. So it's an extensive calculation. Again, it would be used when you're plotting long distances, and it's important to understand the curvature, and you want to know how to project your meridians.
So now, how do you accommodate for the fact that the Earth is actually flat, though, in all these calculations? Oh. And if that was complicated enough where you had to listen to it a few times to really get what it all meant, well, I don't blame you, because I'm in the same boat. The long and short of it is that longitude is a highly complicated equation to figure out, and latitude is fairly easy. Easy by Joe's standards, not mine, dear Lord, it's still well beyond my comprehension. Now, before I wrap things up here, I did say that I was going to have Tony go through just a few more of those tools that were used by the geographers on a somewhat regular basis, just to get a bit of a better sense on just how complicated some of these things could get. And as he's talking through some of these devices, take note of not only how technically impressive they are, but how beautiful their craftsmanship is, from the metal working to the artwork on their faces.
This is what we would call a theodolite, measuring on a horizontal plane. It has 4 sight vanes, has a compass in the center, as we talked before. It works the very same way with the magnetic needle, the 360-degree face with 90-degree quadrants. Surveyors will measure in quadrants, 90 degrees. And so this has 4 sight vanes, like I say, and it has 2 stationary, and this has an alloday that will spin so that we can do angles. This is an all original except for this screw. This is all original. Staff head, the theodolite itself, and as you can see it too, all these machines or instruments were made hand engraved with dividing engines. A lot of times they're in clockmakers guilds or instrument guilds, and you can just see the craftsmanship and how great these gentlemen were in their skill. This is what we call a French graphometer. It is like a semicircle, semi-circumference. It does 180 degrees. Of course, all we have to do is take our meridian, turn it around, and it does 360 degrees. But you'll see a different type of staff head than you did on the others. Like I say, this has an alliday that swings much like the other, but it's only half of the circle. Has a compass in here for orientation, and the maker's name is, you'll see right here, it's Cabot, and it was made in 1768. This particular instrument is a simple theodolite, meaning it doesn't have a compass in the center, so we're not going to be able to orientate it. But it is much like the other theodolite, which has 4 vanes, has a 360-degree azimuth, and has the alliday that spins. This is somewhere between 1750, 1775, unsigned, but we know the ornate finials like this bring it into that date.
And remember, everyone, that this amazing collection, all of this knowledge, the time spent with me to make this video, and of course, these guys trudging all this stuff out to even the smallest of reenactment events, like this one at the Adena Mansion in Ohio, is all done by volunteers, by reenactors who are doing all of this and helping to educate the public out of their passion for the time period.
You know, it's interesting, talk about the geographers today. We're really quite an eclectic bunch of people. A lot of reenacting regiments are centrally located. You know, you'll have someone that comes from a smaller geographic area of a state or someplace where the guys get together. But the geographers, we come from all over the place because it is a rather unique subject. And I suppose you have to have a unique interest to want to participate with the geographers. But I originally came from New York State when I first got involved with the geographers. We've got people from New England, we've got people from the South, we've got people from the Midwest, we've got people from all over the areas, and it's really refreshing to do something different rather than the typical military impression. Yeah.
Right. Paul is a retired professional land surveyor from New York. We have people that are pilots for that fly airplanes. We have fellow engineers. We have industrial mechanics. We have people from the EPA. Just a gamut.
Not that those things are a requirement to be a geographer. I mean, primarily it's just the interest and wanting to participate with our group. You know? Right.
So Paul is coming through survey. Some of us are coming through a different avenue to the point where we're learning the old ways. Then you get into collecting of the instruments, collecting of the knowledge. So reenactment to me has been one of the best things that I've ever done. You've got travel, you've got camaraderie, you've got knowledge. If you know something, don't you want to tell it? Don't you want to have others know what you know?
And we've been fortunate that we've developed a bit of notoriety and credibility. So it's been very, very, very nice because it's gained us some access to some things that typically you wouldn't be able to see as far as historical documents and equipment and things like that.
Well, we've done a survey on Constitution Island back in, I believe it was 2008. We've been in the archives of Smithsonian, Library of Congress. We've been on
Mount Vernon.
General Washington's front lawn. We've been on American Philosophical Lawn, talking as back about in 2012 during the transit of Venus, talking about that. So we not only just talk about the war efforts or the maps that our men did, but this is an age of enlightenment. We are men of science are wanting to know about their world about them, and whether it be biology or mathematics, surveying, any of that sort of thing. So it's an exciting time that you see all sorts of different arts that are combined or interesting. It's an awesome sport, hobby, whatever you want to call it.
It is.
And it can get involved at times.
And, you know, surveying today has become a lot different because of the technology that's available, but the basic concept of surveying is the same. That's been going on since the Egyptians, I'm sure. So it's just plain cool, you know, some of the things we get to do and can do, you know.
And if you happen to be interested in getting involved with an organization like this, I'll include their information down below. It's an amazing group of guys, incredibly kind, very personable, and they really do know their stuff. And hey, if you enjoyed this video and you learned something new, I am sure that these guys would love to hear from you if you just wanted to send them a quick word of thanks for doing what they do. And if you're interested in learning more about the topics of surveying and geography during the American War of Independence and the 18th century more on the whole, well, there's an amazing book which these guys were actually involved in the process of the production of the book. I'll include that in a link down below for you to look at as well. I'll let Tony sign off really quick, and then I'll do the same myself.
I'm Tony Holbrook, commander of the Department of Geographers. You can check us out on Facebook. Just look up Department of Geographers, see where we're going, where we've been. Appreciate you watching the video. Thank you.
Thank you to Tony, Paul, Doug, and Joe of the Department of the Geographers for taking time out of their day to speak with me. And of course, thank you all for watching, particularly those of you who support my work directly on Patreon, for you really are the ones who make all of this possible. Now, Mr. Holbrook has requested that I read off the names of those individuals that we know were a part of the real department, because of course, without them, this video never would have happened either. And so these men, again, known men of the Department of the Geographer to the Army, were the Geographers to the United States, Robert Erskine, Simeon DeWitt, and Thomas Hutchins. Known surveyors and assistant geographers were John Armstrong, James Elliott, William Gray, Benjamin Lodge, William McMurray, William Scull, and John William Watkins. Known chain bearers and guards were Thomas Grant, Corporal Calhoun, and men at various points from Hand's Brigade, Stark's Brigade, the 1st Pennsylvania Brigade, the 1st New Jersey Brigade, the 2nd and 4th Massachusetts Brigades, and Daniel Morgan's Corps. And known civilian surveyors were Jacob Broom, David Pye, and Isaac Vrooman. Until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.